Hi, good day once again. So, for today's topic, what we'll be tackling about is the literary movement during the contemporary period. So, before we move on our discussion focusing on the contemporary period, so let's have first a recap of the different periods of literature. So, if you do have your background in world literature, we can say that the history of literature can be traced back during the classical period. So when we talk of classical period, of course, we are pertaining to the Greeks and then the Romans. And then after the classical period, we have the medieval period wherein this is a period in literature wherein those stories about knights and shining armors were become known. And this was also the period wherein in the period in the world history wherein there is really the downfall of the Greeks and the Romans, wherein there are a lot of things that happened during the time, political turmoil. Um, there were also invasion. A lot of things happened. So this was considered as the downfall of the Roman periods or the Romans and even the Greeks. So for medieval period, we will now move on to Renaissance period, so rebirth period of rebirth. So this was a period wherein they are now regaining their strength. So there is really the so-called rebirth on this period. And from the Renaissance period, then we have the Enlightenment period and the Romantic period, then the modern period, then the contemporary period, modern or the contemporary period. So that is where it it all started. So each period has its own significant effect or significant contribution on the development of literature. So for this discussion, we'll be focusing on the contemporary period. So when we talk of the contemporary period, this is the period that can be traced back from 1940s up to the present time. So this is what we call the contemporary period. Although this present time, we are considering it as the uh, postmodernism, or sometimes we often call it the 21st century literature. It's still when we talk of contemporary period, it still falls on the current time. Okay, so uh, this is now the periods, the period, the movement or the literary movement during the contemporary period. So as I mentioned to you a while ago, the contemporary period began from the 1940s up to the current time. But for our focus on this discussion, the literary movement will be focusing from 1940s to 1990s. So 1940s, it is distributed as 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then 1990s. So you see the 10-year gap for each literary movement. So let's begin from the 1940s, which is objectivist poets. So what's that objectivist poets? Okay, so the term objectivist was coined by Louis Zukofsky in 1930 for objectivist 1931, although it started 1940, but the term already exists in 1930s, wherein it was coined by Louis Zukofsky in one of the special issues of Poetry. Poetry is the title of the magazine for which he served as guest editor. So he used the term objectivist 1931 by the time, and then when objectivist poets came into popularity, they adopted the term. Hence, they were called objectivist poets. So again, when we talk of literary movement, we are pertaining to group of poets, the group of writers who do have their own objectives, their goals that they would like to contribute, that somehow they would like to create change. And oftentimes they're just a group of people who share the same sentiments about poetry, who share the same styles, So in short, it's more of barkadahan, more group of individuals. Okay, so the Objectivist Poets were a loose-knit group of second-generation modernists who emerged in the 1930s, and most of them were Americans, and common personalities during this period were Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams. So how come that they become close? So it just so happened that when William Carlos Williams um, wrote anthologies or collections of his poems, it was, and then Ezra Pound also wrote collections of poems. So each of them were exchanging ideas, exchanging thoughts. That's when the friendship began, and there were times that one of them became the or wrote the introduction of their literary collection, so that they have that kind of relationship. So the basic tenets of objectivist poetics as defined by Louis Zukofsky were to treat the poem as an object and to emphasize sincerity, intelligence, and the poet's ability to look clearly at the world. So when we talk of objectification, so that is what we meant by objectification or objectivity. So the poet ought to compose always with sincerity. So what is that sincerity? So it is referring to the need for the author to really expound what he really felt or what she really felt about the content or about the topic of what he or she is writing. So it has to be reflected, the emotion, the right emotion has to be reflected on those literary works. So they're very much particular on the kind of content. So, the most scrupulous attention both to the objects and events about which he writes or she writes, and to the particulars of his own language, and the finished poem ought to exhibit objectification and object-like, tangible form as if language were material. So when we talk of tangible form as if language were material, it seems like that if you are the reader and then you read that particular work, you will feel the veracity or the truthfulness on the said literary work. So that's what they would like to ponder on when they created this movement, that they would like this that objectification be felt by the readers. In these principles, objectivist poetics goes beyond the imagism. So Ezra Pound kasi is more of imaginative. So when we talk of imaginative, it's purely fictional, wherein uh, although the message is true, the message is good, parang something like that. Yet when you read that particular work, somehow goes beyond what truth is. Let's say, for example, when you ask that when you ask someone to when you let a stone to speak, you know what? That's imagism, eh? Imagism. So you let a particular thing to which as if it is talking. That is imagism. Imagism. For the objectivist poets, there has to be reality in it that has to be reflected on those literary works. Okay, so which were in on that imagism, there is a prescribed rules for dealing with images and using language, but largely failed to discuss the finished form that the poem ought to assume, because that's what want the objectivist poets. So they are more of the forms, more of the veracity or the accuracy of the content that of the message that they would like to convey. So that is for the first set of literary movement, the objectivist poets. So let's see the development of poetry, development of literature from this point in time. So in the 1950s, as 10 years after, so we have the beat generation, Black Mountain Poets, then the Confessional Poetry, then the New York School. So this is actually the period when there are a lot of controversies, controversies that were explored by writers, especially the Beat generation and then the confessional poetry. So they do have a lot of controversies that they reflected in in their literary works. So most of them were novels. Okay, so we have Kerouac, Ginsberg. So these people during the Beat generation, they are really um, not that highly criticized, but they did create controversies because of their works. So Beat movement, also called the Beat generation, is a group of is composed of American social and literary movement originating in the 1950s and centered in the Bohemian artist communities of San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles, Venice West, and New York cities in Greenwich Village. So why do they call themselves as Beat movement? So it is adherence to self-style as beat, originally meaning weary, but later also connoting a musical sense, a beatic spirituality in other meanings. So it's kind of referring to the beat of the music, but they are treating it somehow symbolically, wherein that sense has can be symbolically attributed to being weary. Okay, we want to compare something unique, something unusual. So, and they're visibly called beatniks, which express their alienation from conventional or square. Kaya kasi dahil beat, wary. So, something to do with being unusual. And adopting a style of dress, manners, and hip vocabulary borrowed from jazz musicians. So they consolidate all these kind of things because these writers were wild. They were literally they were wild. So they do somehow there's sometimes in their some point in their life wherein they taken drugs. They went to bars. They slept with different girls. So they really do have that kind of freedom to do what they want to do. They're freewheeling. They would do a lot of things that they would like to do. That's why their literary works, especially their novels, reflected those things that I mentioned. So the Beat generation was a literary started by a group of authors whose work explored and influenced American culture and politics in the post-war era. So despite that being freely spirited individuals, that they would do everything they would want to do, they are actually into wanting for change. And they use their talent in writing in order for these people to also learn from their own mistakes. So that's what Beat Generation did to did during their time. So they used their personal experiences, reflected those personal experiences in their literary works in order for them to to educate every individuals. Okay, so the central elements of beat culture are the rejection of standard narrative values, yeah, making a spiritual quest, the exploration of American and Eastern religions, the rejections of economic materialism, explicit portrayals of the human condition. Ito pa, the, the one that I mentioned to you, the experimentation with psychedelic drugs and sexual liberation and exploration. These are the things that beat writers do during their time. So you can really see from those examples that we'll be discussing in the next days to come. So you will be realizing those things that I'm mentioning here from Alan's work. Okay, so you can really see it from those literary works. Now, the Black Mountain Poets. So, unlike the first two literary movements, so the Black Mountain poets were named after the college or the school where they come from. So most of them were students of Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and their literary movement uh, they was derived from the name of this college. That's why they are called the Black Mountain Poets. So most of these writers include Alson, Creeley, Duncan, and they are promoted in non-traditional poetics described by Alson in 1950 as projective verse. So Alson advocated an improvisational, open-form approach to poetic composition driven by the natural patterns of breath and adherence. So it does not conform with what objectivist writers would want to have that kind of standard formula when writing literary works, or even the new formalist approach, or the Russian formalist approach, wherein they are very much strict with the forms, with the numbers, the rhyme scheme, and even the the totality of the literary work itself. They go beyond on that kind of standard of writing literary works. So they are driven by, again, by the natural patterns of breath and adherence. So somehow they are following the free verse approach when it comes to writing literary works, especially in poetry, of course. So though the Black Mountain Poets never labeled themselves or self-identified as a school of poetry, they are a group of interconnected poets, many of whom were connected together through Black Mountain College, which is an experimental art-centered university in North Carolina, which operated from 1930 to 1957. So that is where uh, this group come from. Then we have confessional poetry, is also another um, intriguing group of poets. So, confessional poetry is the poetry of the personal or I. So, from the term itself, confessional poetry, it refers to the personal encounters of the writers themselves, which also be wherein you can also consider the others' experience that the writers express in their literary work. So, they are as if the ones who experience it because they use the pronoun I. So we cannot directly tell that those experiences are the experiences of the writers themselves, but because of of the pronoun I that they use in their literary, it is as if that they are the ones who experience it. But it's not necessary that they are always using the pronoun I in their style of writing. Okay, so this style of writing emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s in association with Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath was the known writer during this period, and Sexton and Snodgrass. So in our discussion in the class, we'll be discussing about the work of Sylvia Plath. Lowell's book Life Studies was a highly personal account of his life and familial ties, and had a significant impact on poetry, American poetry. While Plath and Saxton were both students of Lowell and noted that his work influenced their own writing. So what is that confessional poetry? Once again, so confessional poetry of the mid 20th century dealt with subject matter that previously hadn't been openly discussed in American poetry. So what are these things that hadn't been openly discussed in American poetry? So let's say, for example, private experiences with and feelings about death, trauma, depression, relationships. These are all addressed in this type of manner, often in autobiographical manner. This is what I mentioned about the use of I, wherein it is as if that is the experience of the writers themselves. That is why it is called the autobiographical manner. So Saxon in particular was interested in the psychological aspect of poetry, having started writing at the suggestions of her therapist. Okay, so that's on part of Sexton. Okay, so that's confessional poetry. It's more of confession, from the terms of confession, confessing those topics that are not further discussed or not further discussed in poetry in America during this period. The New York School refers to a group of experimental painters and a coterie of associated poets who lived and worked in downtown Manhattan in the 1950s and 60s. So the painter Robert Motherwell coined the name, playing off the pre-World War II École de Paris, a group of painters that included Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse. So what's the New York School is all about? So the New York School was not an academic institution, but rather a community built on proximity, relationships, and similarities in styles, methods, and subject matters. Just so happened that this group of individuals, they are all writers in New York, and wherein they form a group which they call the New York School. So there's nothing um, significant, or shall you say, one thing, uh, one contribution that we can actually pinpoint that this is a New York school instead of the fact that all of them were from New York and most of them were writers or poets or artists from New York that joined together because of their similar interest in poetry or in arts in general. So though stylistic diversity exists within the group, that's why I mentioned to you a while ago that unlike the previous groups, they have something that they would like to to be remembered of or to change, to innovate. New York School is very diverse. They don't have that kind of approach that was mentioned by the Objectivist Poets, who is into form. The Beat generation is into psychedelic drugs, sexual um, desire topics, all about those things, those morbid things during the big generation. So just like the Black Mountain College, New York School is also diversified. So it's just that they are a group of individuals who really has this interest in poetry or in arts in general. And despite that, they are influenced by literary surrealism and abstract expressionist painting. They respond to the events of the day and without embracing the heavy seriousness characteristics of some post-war intellectuals. Okay, then in the 1960s, we have the British poetry revival, New Wave or the science fiction, and the Nouveau Roman. So this is now the period wherein there is an introduction of a different genre in different topics in poetry. So most of those that we mentioned a while ago, focusing on the society, focusing on personal. Okay, so just like the objectivist, the bit generation, something to do with their social critique, their observation of the society. That is where the content of their literary works were derived. For the confessional poetry, it's more of the individual's experience that are reflected. Well, of course, the previous one, which is the Black Mountain College and the New York School, which are very diversified. But now in 1960s, this is the period wherein there is an introduction of a new theme, and even a new form of literature that I think during this period can be considered as emerging form of literature. So these are the British poetry revival, the New Wave with science fiction, and the Nouveau Roman. So let's have first the British poetry revival. So the British revival was a movement that lasted from 1960s to 1970s, and their main goal was to bring back poetry that was based on progressive ideas and romanticism. So romanticism was during the romantic period, that was after the enlightenment period, where in romanticism all although from the term itself, most of the theme of that period are about love, but it was also the period in Romanticism wherein Gothic literature came into popularity. So when we talk of Gothic literature, um, the known persona there is Mary Shelley's work, which is the Frankenstein. Okay, so wherein this is the period in romantic period is the period wherein Gothic literature such as theme about vampire and monsters were become popular. So it break the traditional it broke the common theme during that time, which is more of romance. You see the contrasting concept in romantic period from romance, and then this gothic literature came into popularity instead of those romantic theme of literature. So they would like to revive that kind of of literature during the British Poetry Revival. Okay, that's why they call it the British Poetry Revival. So the British Poetry Revival understood that poetry doesn't have a judicial system and there are no rules. So they focus on the process of perception, consciousness, and putting into language in a poem rather than what is perceived or experienced. So they focus on the the importance of language as it creates meaning to the importance of language in the poem to create a flavor, to create a meaning to the literary works. So various forms of the estrangement effect are a device that prevents the audience from losing themselves completely into the character that is created by the actor. So parts pertaining to the drama are added to enable focus on the language in process of the poem itself. So what are some of the highlights? So a sense of self-voice. So improvisation, experimentation instead of a traditional form or pattern. There may be aspects of performance in both the writing and the delivery of the text. Because, just mentioned, um, we focus on the language in British Poetry Revival. Now, this is the new theme, the new wave or the science fiction. So the new wave is a movement in science fiction produced in the 1960s and the 1970s and characterized by a high degree of experimentation in both form and content, a literary or artistic sensibility, and a focus on soft as opposed to hard science. When talk of hard science, we're pertaining to mad scientists. So new wave writers often saw themselves as part of the modernist tradition in fiction, and the new wave was conceived as a deliberate break from the traditions of pulp science fiction, which many of the new wave writers involved considered irrelevant and ambitious. So the new wave has something to do with stories portraying about science. However, not that hard science wherein um, somehow morbid. Okay, somehow morbid. So the hard science, morbid stories, but this is more of a soft science fiction, the new wave. The new wave science fiction writers of the 1960s emphasized stylistic experimentation and literary merit over the scientific accuracy or prediction of hard science fiction writers. So on this style, so transformation in style was at the heart of the new wave movement. So they would like to create a, a feeling for the readers that science fiction is something that is relatable to the audience. So they combine with controversial topics. The new wave introduced innovations in form, style, and aesthetics involving literary highbrow ambitions and experimental use of language should significantly less focus on hard science, fiction, scientific accuracy, or technology in its content. So they want it to make it more relatable. So that's what we meant by soft science fiction, relatable to the audience. Wherein in hard science, it's really hard to digest on part of the audience. The Nouveau Roman new novel, French no, the French Nouveau Roman, also called more broadly the anti-novel, avant-garde novel of the mid-20th century, that marked a radical departure from the conventions of the traditional novel in that it ignores such as elements as plot, dialogue, linear narrative, and human interest. The traditional way of writing novel follows the three-part structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and it follows the usual linear narrative wherein um, chronological proper chronological arrangement of the content of the literary works. Okay, so that is the old form of novels that the Nouveau Roman would like to change. They would like to give something different to their audience, something that would really test the comprehension or will let the audience to think of the novel or the story in the novel. It starts from the premise that the potential of the traditional novel had been exhausted. So gone are those days that they keep on repeating the same style wherein people are asking for something that will be new to them. Hence, the writers of new novels sought new avenues of fictional exploration. In their efforts to overcome literary habits and to challenge the expectations of their readers, they deliberately frustrated conventional literary expectations. They are avoiding any expression of the author's personality, preferences, or values. So that is that what they did in order for them to really uh, made effort on giving something new and to challenge the expectations of their readers. So they rejected the elements of entertainment, dramatic progress. This dramatic progress follows the three-part structure and dialogue that serve to delineate character or develop its plot. So they would like the reader to think of of the story. This they are trying to promote critical thinking among the readers that would really entice them, that would really make them think on what will happen next. What will happen next once they read that particular text that will make them more uh, enticed of reading it. Wherein, which isn't like before that when they are reading it, they already knew what will happen next in the story. So this time, they would like to change that. They would like to break that kind of behavior from the readers, wherein they are able to predict what will happen next. Now, in Nouveau Roman, they would like to have a different one. They would want it to be unpredictable on part of the reader. So that is what expected from these writers that there are a lot of twists and turns in the story. In place of reassuring convention, these French authors offered the reader more demanding fiction, presenting compressed, repetitive, or only partially explained events whose meaning is rarely clear or definitive, where it's up to the reader to think of interpreting the text. Let's say, for example, they will be giving a cliffhanger, then they'll be the one to think of what will be the ending of that story. Okay, so that's what Nouveau Roman did during this period. Then the 1970s, which is language poet. So from this movement, language poet, it is something to do with the language, the importance of language in making meaning, not the meaning controlling the language. It's the language that should control the meaning. So that's their principle. So the language school of poetry started in the 1970s as a response to traditional American poetry in form. So what are these traditional American poetry and form. So they were derived from the Black Mountain in New York schools, wherein um, The language poetry aimed to place complete emphasis on the language of the poem and to create a new way for the reader to interact with the work. So language poetry is associated with leftist politics and was also affiliated with several literary magazines published in the 70s, which include this magazine and the LA and GUAGE magazine. So the key aspects of language poetry include the idea that language, this is what I mentioned a while ago, that language dictates meaning rather than the other way around. So it has to be the language that will create meaning, that will give meaning to the text. I mean, if it is the language that dictates the meaning, then meaning can be um, varied. That will now lie on the interpretation of um the reader. So language poetry also seeks to involve the reader in the text. That's what I mentioned to you, that language dictates meaning because their main objective is to make the reader be involved in the text, somehow similar to reader response, criticism, placing importance on reader participation in the construction of meaning. So, by breaking up poetic language, the poet is requiring the reader to find a new way to approach the text. So, again, they would like the reader to think, so similar with what Nouveau Roman would like to do in the novels. So, language poets would like the reader to think of, of the poetry that they are reading. In the 1980s, the following are the literary movement: cyberpunk, maximalism, new formalism, poetry slam. Just like the previous periods, just like the in the 1970s. So 1980s also began to introduce another form of or another theme for literature. So the first one is cyberpunk. So it is a science fiction, although it was derived in the science fiction in the new wave. It was derived from there. So it's a science fiction subgenre characterized by countercultural anti-heroes trapped in a dehumanized high-tech future. So it means to say that technology has something to do with uh, that dehumanize high-tech future. So it's more of uh, futuristic literature during the time. So imagine it was in 1980s, and then they already have that kind of mind thinking that this kind of high tech future will happen. So the word cyberpunk was coined by writer Bruce Bethke, who wrote a story with that title in 1982. So there was a film, or there was a story rather, about cyberpunk, and that's the term cyberpunk was used as a representation of this literary movement. So he derived the term from the word cybernetics, which is in social science, it is a tradition. Cybernetics as a tradition in social science that has something to do with technology or the science of replacing human functions with computerized ones. And punk, the cacophonous music and nihilistic sensibility that developed in the youth culture during the 1970s and 80s. Hence, cybernetics and punk become cyberpunk. So, science fiction editor Gardner Dozois is generally credited with having popularized the term. So cyberpunk, again, it is a science fiction. It's more futuristic. There is already characters involving the machines, talking machines, wherein a hero uh, a hero went to a different world with lots of robots, something like that. Wherein just like Star Trek, okay, just like Star Wars, something like that. Cyberpunk. So maximalism, from the term self maximalist. Okay, so the term maximalist fiction or maximalism meanwhile denotes fictional works particularly novels that are unusually long and complex, are digressive in style and make use of a wide array of literary devices and techniques. So again, it is unusually long, meaning to say it is longer than the usual, okay, longer than the usual length of a novel. So among the novelists associated with this style are David Foster Wallace, etc. So maximalism, from the term they are maximizing the length of the literary works, especially the novel. And maximalism is also known as maximalist fiction, is a style of writing that is most associated with postmodern literary movement. So the style emphasizes digression, reference, and elaboration to an excessive degree, creating an overtly complex work in the progress or in the process rather. Overtly complex work in the process. So an early maximalist writer was James Joyce, who wrote Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. They were known for uh, being excessive in detail and length. So when we talk of maximalism, again, it is beyond the usual length of a novel. Okay, so they are maximizing the need for them to really address what they would like to address in the novel. So hence making it longer. So that is why I think there is now the tendency that some of the novels are in a form of trilogy. So in this modern time, we have some literary works that are in a form of a trilogy, where a three-part series, just like Harry Potter. I think Harry Potter is more than a three-part series, but in this present time, sometimes seven or six, depending on depending on the demand from the readers. So I think that is already an implication of maximalism, although uh, although it is in a form of more than three-part series. So more contemporary maximalist writers include Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace. And now we have uh, Stephanie Meyer, who else? The author of Harry Potter, the author of The 50 Shades of Grey, and so the Divergent. Okay, so there are an example of maximalism. Then we have new formalism. So new formalism, the reason why it is called new formalism, because it was derived, or it began from Russia. We call it the Russian formalism, where in Russian formalism they are very much focused on, for the terms of formalism, on the form, but they do have a lot of standards that they're looking into when analyzing specific literary works. So that was during the Russian formalism. So in America, they developed a different one, which they called new formalism, which is more specific compared to Russian formalism. So hence, they term it new formalism. And actually, those who those who delve into Russian formalism went to America, and they discuss these things to the Americans, wherein they also contributed on the on new formalism. Okay, so that's how they work hand in hand on this. However, new formalism became popular in America. So it's a development of poetry, or American poetry, which pay attention, very much attention, on the traditional forms of verse in terms of meter, rhyme, and stanzic symmetry. Disheartened both by the overwhelming popularity of free verse during the Cold War and by the notion that metrical patterns were somehow antithetical to organic truth, new formalist poets and their advocates rallied behind the traditions, aesthetics, and practices which they believe had been all but abandoned by many of their contemporaries. Yet new formalism is still being applied up to this time because there are still many writers who are very much particular with the form, with the rhyme scheme. Then we have poetry slam. So poetry slam can be attributed on what we know at present as spoken word poetry. So they are in similar style, wherein they are into delivering the lines in front of the audience and making the audience be involved in the said uh, delivery of the poetry. So slam poetry is a performance poetry, just like the spoken word poetry that combines performance, wherein if you happen to see those who are performing spoken word poetry, you can really see how they have um, utilized the need of having an action as they present their literary works. Okay, and sometimes and most of the time, spoken word poetry is presented as a form of competition. Okay, and audience participation, of course. It is performed at events called poetry slam or simply slams. So the name slam came from how the audience has the power to praise or sometimes destroy a poem from the high energy performance style of the poets. I'm sure that all of you had already watched spoken word poetry. So that's how poetry slam can be described. They are almost similar. Actually, spoken word poetry is considered as poetry slam. It was termed poetry slam during this time, during that early period. So the known poetry slam performer was Markel Smith in 1980s. So he had idea to bring poetry back to the people, and by doing such, the poetry should be performed in front of the people. In the 1990s, which is uh, this current time, we have the post-cyberpunk. So we have already mentioned of cyberpunk a while ago. So what makes post-cyberpunk differ from the cyberpunk, which was originated earlier? So post-cyberpunk picks up where cyberpunk left off, meaning to say, uh, it extends what cyberpunk has to be. Whereas cyberpunk was a darker and edgier riposte to older science fiction intended to portray what might happen if we don't all destroy ourselves. Post-cyberpunk is intended to present a less pessimistic, more realistic vision. Where cyberpunk is an anti-corporate and anti-government, post-cyberpunk is willing to give both parties redeeming features. Okay, so there is a redeeming features wherein at the end of the stories there is a tendency that both parties involved into conflict will be joined together. So that's it. That is a redeeming features. Hence, post cyberpunk would like to create that kind of positive message towards the audience. Where cyberpunk portrays the future as a crapsack world, post-cyberpunk post-society will probably be about the same, just with cooler gadgets and crapsaccharin world aspects. Okay, so meaning to say, it's really promoting optimism, positivity, uh, in this period. So where cyberpunk is futuristic, forward thinking, and on the cutting edge, so is post cyberpunk. This is what makes them similar. They are both futuristic. What post cyberpunk has that separates it from pure cyberpunk work is an emphasis on positive socialization. So that's what I kept on keep on mentioning a while ago, that positivity. Typical post-cyberpunk protagonists as anchored in their society rather than adrift in it. So they have careers, friends, obligations, responsibilities, and all the trappings of ordinary life. So they are using the characters to portray that positivity, the message of positivity among the people, which is unlike with in Cyberpunk, they are using science to destroy things, wherein science is only destroying things, destroying the reality. Let's say, for example, that particular invention will create deluge on a particular society. That's what cyberpunk is all about. Post cyberpunk would give us a message that science or the technology will give us something that will be benefit the humanity in general, which is like in cyberpunk, the destruction, deluge might happen once this particular machine or technology will be invented. So that's how pessimistic cyberpunk is as compared to post cyberpunk, which sends a message of positivity. Cyberpunk characters frequently seek to topple or exploit corrupt social orders. to topple, to topple or exploit corrupt social orders. However, it does not um, all this go beyond what post-cyberpunk is. For cyberpunk, characters tend to seek ways to live in or even strengthen an existing social order or help construct a better. Just like what we mentioned, that there is a redeeming features in post-cyberpunk wherein um, those individuals or group in conflict in a particular uh, story will be connive again and they will redeem once again and they will be joining together in helping in sending message of positivity. So those are the preview of the literary movement during the contemporary period. So those are the popular literary works. Since our subject is contemporary popular, so those are the contemporary popular literary works during the time. So as we go through with our lecture, we will be discussing those emerging literature, and are those emerging literature will be resonated are those merging literature are still the same as it was before. So let us see what are those emerging literature later on at the latter part of our uh, lecture. Okay, so that's it for today. So thank you very much for your time and adios.